Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first professional luncheon of the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan at our new headquarters. My name is Andrew Horvath, and I am a former president of this club. And since I'm a former president, let me, before introducing our main speaker, also introduce two other former presidents of the Japan Stanford Association, Mr. Sasaki and Mr. Nakagawa, who have brought with them, who have made it possible for a large contingent of Stanford alumni to be here, which is, of course, quite appropriate since our speaker is from Stanford, where he has been for about a quarter of the century. And how close, how shall we say, preordained it was that Richard Dasher should become a maven of innovation. I had an opportunity to sense this. He was a few minutes late, and I was very worried that he might be lost, but of course, innovation people are never really lost. It was the taxi driver who was lost. And so I had to punch in the letters of his address, and I realized the first two letters were R&D. Okay, all right, okay. So you can see it's preordained that his parents knew exactly where he was heading. And by that token, by that same token, he also knows where innovation is heading in the United States, Japan, and China. I should add that we have actually known each other almost 30 years on and off. Richard Dasher has had a very interesting past. He was at one time destined to be a concert clarinetist, but he decided to give that up for linguistics and got a PhD in that. And then he taught, well, actually he was in charge of the program to teach diplomats in Yokohama, if the United States, Canada, and the ANZUS countries. And that's where we first met. No, I'm not a diplomat, but we did meet there. And then we met in Stanford in 1994, where I was on a research scholarship, and he was already teaching in Japanese, or in charge of a program to teach Japanese to the engineers at Stanford. And he got to know so many of the engineers that he found out absolutely everything about all their projects they were doing. And as he said to me a minute ago, when you are in a playground, you really do get to find out a lot of things, and it's a lot of fun. And so he became an expert on innovation and these technology links between Japan and the United States, Japan and the United States and Asia in general. So this is a truly interesting story. It is not always on the front page, unlike the story which happened this morning, which is the rearrest of someone who knows a lot about technology. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker, who is much more serious than I am. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm not as much of a quack as my introduction sounds like. Actually, it turns out that the kind of research that I did on language structure can be applied very well to business problems. If you look at how a new use of a word in a language will ripple through the whole language and cause different changes in meaning in other words in that language, you find that a new technology will ripple through an industry structure and cause all sorts of structural changes, even in remote parts of the industry. So that's the kind of research I've been doing for the last 30 years. I have been looking a lot at the current turmoil in technology between the US and China. And today what I'm going to really focus on is how Japan, specifically Japanese innovation, plays into this whole picture. So first of all, I want everyone to think about how Japan will help us to understand the current turmoil between the US and China. Second, I do want to point out that I think innovation is being rekindled in Japan. And then finally, Yes, we have to end up with, unfortunately, some kind of worrying slides about what everybody, Japan and China and the U.S., need to worry about from now. So first of all, this year I have a real sense of deja vu. When I first moved here to Japan in 1986, there were the semiconductor agreement between Japan and the U.S. had just been signed. The U.S. had accused Japan of IP theft. The U.S. had accused Japan of government-industry collusion, which was very well known because of things like these horrible METI projects, back then METI projects. The VLSI project in the late 70s frightened an awful lot of people in the United States. And this was seen as something that was targeting world domination in a particular industry. Japan was accused of an unfair low cost of capital, mainly because of all the government support, and therefore it was accused of dumping. And one of the terms of the agreement was that the United States would get to say what the cost structure of Japanese semiconductor technologies from Japanese companies would be. That's kind of remarkable. Japan was accused of having a closed domestic market. At the time, foreign chip makers had less than 10% of the Japan market, and numeric targets were agreed on in the semiconductor agreement to bring that up to 20%. So China looks very similar, but it's a different set of technologies. What is very similar between China and Japan is that the technologies under discussion are a critical element. In the case of Japan, critical components, and really in the case of the Chinese telecom companies like Huawei and ZTE, it's a critical layer of a truly ubiquitous network. If there's a big difference between the two, besides the fact that we don't really have an agreement with China yet, there are several things. First of all, I think you could argue that Japan always realized that it depended a lot more on the United States than China wants to admit, not only economically, but also in regard to security issues. And the other part is that the kind of technologies we're talking about now are almost like oxygen in the atmosphere. They surround everyone on a daily basis. This worldwide internet protocol-based communications network is involved in real-time communications, often controlling things, or certainly being used for analysis. Everything from your smartphone, which now is how you go to the bank, and it's also, you know, monitoring my health right now, to your automobile, to door locks, refrigerators, kids' toys, you name it. Humans are not able to watch all of this communication going on. Jet engines are reporting directly back to the manufacturer, not even passing by the airline. Home energy management systems are finding new ways to create marital instability because someone wants it warmer and someone wants it cooler, right? And the machine keeps trying to learn. About 75 or 80% of all of the stock trading on public exchanges since 2014 has been done by automated trading programs. So in that kind of a context, the concern now between the U.S. and China may really be more about national security than it is just about economics. Certainly with the kind of communications technologies that are being developed, you can locate an asset, whether that's a military vehicle or a person who makes a decision, within a few centimeters from anywhere else on the world. So that kind of thing has made this competition very intense. It's all about cloud computing, and this kind of cloud computing is universal. This is really the most interconnection the world has ever seen. There are big energy networks, but they tend not to be much bigger than individual countries. There are water systems, but they tend to only deal with a few countries. This is really something that is worldwide. And so it's already become universal. And what's going on is that we're seeing an intersection between a new technology development and what I would call a typical path of industry evolution, which starts with government research and development. In the US, most of these have some connection with defense because it's very difficult in the United States to support corporate research with government money. That just does not look good to the people who don't belong to the companies. And so in contrast, in Japan, which after the war could not really on the surface emphasize military defense, government R&D has always been driven by industrial policy as a national defense concern. If you look at the kinds of research that is parallel, in whether it's semiconductors or telecom or new kinds of artificial intelligence, similar things are being supported by METI as are being supported by the DARPA, the Department of Defense in the US. Now, one universal characteristic of this is that the government research is really pre-innovation stage. To really make things other than weapons and things that the government specifically wants, there is a natural handoff to industry to do the innovation. Governments want to save money by buying off the shelf, and of course consumers benefit from having access to the new technologies. Now, this is something that we're very proud of in the US. The internet had started out as DARPANet, and now it is completely private sector. A couple of years ago, ICANN, the organization that controlled all the addresses on the internet, stopped being a US government organization and has now become a multi-stakeholder governed independent private sector organization. But once a technology flows out to industry, once the infrastructure is really kind of established, concerns of efficiency take over. Companies act rationally like companies. Technology standardization will lead a technology to go to the cheapest location. So it will always flow out to a cheaper provider. They start out providing something just as good as a lower price, and oftentimes they come up with something even better. That means that in the advanced economies, you depend on innovation. The innovators have to jump ahead and focus on higher value-added technologies and business lines. Why did the situation happen with Huawei and ZTE? I've talked with a number of electrical engineering professors at Stanford and in other places, and they tell me Huawei is at least a year ahead of what we have in the United States. So if it was IP theft, they did something with it after they got it. But this means that the innovators in the advanced economies have to jump ahead of that. So we've seen this pattern over and over again. Look at automobiles. From the US, we had trading places to Japan, and then Hyundai and Kia and the others came up in Korea. So what does the US industry do? Not the automobile industry. The US is the place that comes up with things like Tesla Motors, or Google's self-driving car, Waymo, or Uber, a new way to make money using cars. You look for the higher value added. Memory chips went from the US to Japan, and then Japan accused Korea of IP theft, and now Samsung is one of the dominant producers of DRAM. At the same time as the US was having this fight with Japan, Intel shifted its focus from memory chips. It started out as a memory chip company, and about 1985 it focused on the microprocessor and changed the entire computing architecture for the next 30 or 40 years. Flat panel displays. Now, if you look at the producers of flat panel displays, you will find one or two left from the United States, but most of them are Taiwan. US manufacturing, which was really worried about what they were going to lose by losing the flat panel display industry, has shifted to flexible robotics, to software-controlled manufacturing. Cell phones, okay, that's left and is going to China. And so Apple is looking for new business. This is not too unusual. And in the telecom, the U.S. companies were not investing in low profit margin areas. That was possible for Huawei and ZTE to do. You can argue whether or not it was government subsidized, but the point is, as a business decision, the U.S. companies made a logical decision. So one of the major attempts that's going on in China now to keep from getting caught in some of the traps of economic development is to focus on artificial intelligence. Not only do they want to avoid dependence on U.S. technologies, there is a famous, economic catch-up model where by the time you do what a more advanced country is doing, they've moved on to something else. So China's trying to leapfrog. And there was a WIPO, World Intellectual Property Organization, study this year about AI patenting. And while the U.S. still dominates in AI patents, China accounted for 17 of the top 20 academic institutions that were involved with AI patenting. And you see at the bottom of this page that equity funding to startups related to artificial intelligence, the majority is now coming from China, not from the United States. So this kind of thing, to understand AI, it's really important to see that AI is a critical tool for what is essentially an industrial revolution. I would count this one as the fourth industrial revolution. Just like mass manufacturing amounted to a second revolution after the first revolution that was basic mechanization, now we're getting a new revolution of how to get value from digital data using new tools that is putting together all of the digitization that's been going on since the 1960s. So artificial intelligence is the current really hot topic. If you look out in the future, there's quantum computing, there's some role for blockchain and some other things too. But AI is a big deal. Now, it's important to remember that artificial intelligence is not necessarily an imitation of a human being. Most approaches are really focusing on some sort of statistically based reasoning. Fuzzy logic was popular even when I was living in Japan, and so this keeps developing. It always includes an element of something called machine learning, where the computing device learns. It repeats the analysis with new data, and every time it gets more accurate. What you hear about deep learning and all sorts of other names used around artificial intelligence is really just a matter of what type of algorithm is being used. There are two big things that people do with artificial intelligence: automation and analytics. So in the US-China competition in AI, Japan is mostly ignored. So last year, Kai-Fu Lee, the former chairman of Google's China operations, wrote the book AI Superpowers. Notice that the subtitle is China, Silicon Valley, and the New World Order. There was a major publication, a 94-page report put out by a series of experts at Stanford and MIT and Harvard, SRI, McKinsey Global Institute, and two AI-focused nonprofits about the state of the art in artificial intelligence in 2018. It includes 3 mentions of Japan, 2 of which are about robotics. And it includes 44 mentions of China. And I'm leaving out the times that these countries appeared on legends of charts and that kind of thing. So Japan's been left out. This kind of really frustrated me, especially because I see AI strengths in Japan. Robotics has been a long-term strength in Japan, and there are some really interesting new things going on. I'd like to call your attention to the company Mujin, which has developed an AI-based software controller for robotics and robotic programming. It used to take months to reprogram a robot that would control a factory line. You can do it in a matter of minutes using this new technology. Mujin has partnered with a major e-commerce company in China, JD, to make the first completely automated distribution warehouse in Shanghai. They received a major award just this year. Another company I'd like to point out is Preferred Networks, which is really Japan's only unicorn startup company. Now, I take the narrow view of unicorn, which means that once a company goes public, you can't call it a unicorn anymore. So Mercari was the first company that was a unicorn in Japan, but Preferred Networks has a valuation of more than $1 billion. They're doing partnerships in transportation with companies like Toyota, in manufacturing with companies like Hitachi, and in healthcare. The Japanese government, just a couple of months ago, issued a list of 92 Japanese startups they think have great prospects for worldwide success. And these include 12 firms tagged with AI or AI control. So you're seeing a lot in AI this way. Why don't you hear more about Japan? Well, let's go back to that chart about industry evolution. Do you notice how Japan is stuck in the middle stage? It was a great place for a while, and then the locus of the kind of mainstream activity went somewhere else. So it's not generating the new paradigms that you can see coming from the US industry throughout this time period. Now, if you want to create a new paradigm, you're really talking about an innovation that would disrupt an existing industry structure. There are two really good sources of disruptive, I almost said destructive, disruptive innovation. One is startup companies themselves. And there's a really well-established theory by Professor Clayton Christensen of Harvard that only startup companies will take on the combination of high risk of both technology failure and also market failure. They don't have any existing business to support, and so they will be built around one idea that will change the world. And if you don't tell the investors you're going to change the world, they won't invest in you. So also possible, though, is partnerships between startup companies and big firms. I've got a slide I'd like to show. But before I do, I've got to ask, when was the last time that a Japanese company attracted worldwide attention through disruptive innovation? Anime? Maybe. Gaming? Yeah, kind of, sort of. Especially Pokemon Go is quite a big thing. But what has not happened is Pokemon Go has not become the basis of a new paradigm of augmented reality gaming. It's great for what it does, but it hasn't changed the whole industry yet. So what I wanted to show was how much this is done between startup companies and big firms in the US. If you look at virtual assistants, and Siri is the grandmother of all virtual assistants, they all involved some sort of partnering between a big firm and a startup company or more. I'd especially like to call attention to Alexa that came out from Amazon. And the Alexa came out of the project that was internal to Amazon's R&D labs, but they bought 3 startup companies in order to develop what we have in our living rooms now. A company to do speech-to-text generation, a company to do natural language processing, and a company to do text-to-speech generation. So they do this because it's fast, because the venture investors have already taken a lot of the risk, and so they will watch to optimize the timing of when they partner with the startup company. Now, Japanese innovation is starting to pick up. The startup sector especially is starting to pick up. This is a chart of the amount of venture capital funding in Japan over the last, sort of 13 or 14 years. I would point out, I've heard that 2018 had almost $3.8 billion of venture capital funding, but I haven't seen how many deals yet. I haven't seen the actual numbers yet. So certainly venture capital funding has risen quite a bit. The second thing is with people, you're seeing for the first time in the last couple of years, a true set of angel investors, Silicon Valley style, in Japan. There have always been wealthy people in Japan. There have always been successful business people who would invest in new companies. But what we have now are people who've gone through a sort of Silicon Valley style growth and exit process where they made a lot of money with their startup, and so they can mentor the next generation of startups through this process. That's a major new development. The labor markets are much more fluid than they used to be, especially for people who are under 35. I'm seeing a lot of university grads who don't want the big company lifestyle. It used to be that was the only logical alternative. The upside couldn't be any better than if you were at a big company, and the downside was a lot worse. This means that there's not just more entrepreneurs in Japan, it's easier for startups to hire good people than it used to be. And that's been one of the major bottlenecks in the Japanese system. Second, and partly connected to this, is I'm seeing more companies founded by teams. It used to be you had a kind of middle-aged, single-person entrepreneur who would start a company and would be the patriarch of the company forever. Now I'm seeing companies that have entrepreneurial strengths in several key management positions of the company. Companies like Mujin, founded by an American and a Japanese together. So you're seeing this new pattern now. I'm also seeing a lot more knowledge flow across sectors. There is robust technology transfer going on from Japanese universities. The University of Tokyo is a real hotbed, partly because they have more venture capital access than just about anybody else in the country. But I'm also seeing very interesting startups coming out of Fukuoka and out of Kyoto. I'm also seeing Japanese students taking much more responsibility for what they learn in university and not just doing what their teachers tell them to do. I've had several people tell me that they studied Python using some MOOC. And so they have looked at Coursera or the other online courses. They're teaching each other. And so the knowledge gap is not nearly as big as a lot of people would think that it is. There are some differences still. In the United States, especially the Silicon Valley model, is that everyone thinks exit from the very beginning of the company. How big can I grow this company? How fast can I grow this company? And how much can I sell it for? And that also includes the entrepreneurs who typically only have a minority share of the company when the company does exit. So if it exits by IPO, they may have 10 or 20% of the company. But in the US, increasingly, exit by being bought by a big company is the main method that companies achieve success, by a 10-to-1 ratio. So this kind of let's grow it as big as possible, as much as possible, naturally leads to this change the world attitude. The Japan model still focuses on early profitability and smaller exits. Typically, the investors are making 2 or 3 times their investment when a company exits by IPO in Japan, which is not bad, but it's not like 50 times. Even after exit, you'll see the entrepreneur founder continuing to play this sort of patriarchal role in the company as being the dominant source of decision-making power. Part of this has to do with the dynamics of governance in Japan and the United States, and this is also in a kind of stage of change. And this pattern leads to a lot of mid-sized companies that focus on long-term partnerships as their main sort of business. Preferred Networks is focusing on one big partnership with a big company after another. It's a very different model for company growth than I think you would have seen in a similar company in the United States. And in Japan, this big company, startup company interaction is still kind of a question mark. 5 years ago, I was able to speak here, and I talked about open innovation between large corporates in Japan and startup companies, and I said I was worried about it. Well, the verdict is not in yet. Many companies are investing large amounts of money in innovation, and this is a new thing. I've tried to ask various people why it's happening. Some people think it is connected with the Abe administration focus on innovation and focus on promotion of startups. But in any case, I'm seeing company after company creating new innovation groups. I'm seeing company after company starting corporate venture capital programs. The jobs in Silicon Valley, the Japanese companies have had tech watchers there for 40 or 50 years. They all have new jobs. They're all looking for companies to partner with in some way or even buy. And frankly speaking, there are pilgrimages by Japanese companies to startup companies in Israel several times a year. I was at a large manufacturing company, I probably shouldn't mention their name here, who was talking about their visits to Israel last year, just yesterday. But it's still rare to find a big company in Japan that will allow this kind of innovation to impact its overall strategic direction. How is the company going to transform itself? Probably the one counterexample is Fujifilm, which saw the end of the film camera industry and invested heavily in biotech. It acquired a quite successful U.S. firm, Cellular Dynamics, and is now really a biotech company. I might also mention Hitachi Zosen, right? Hitachi Shipbuilding no longer calls itself Hitachi Shipbuilding. It's HITZ, HITZ. Okay, anyway, without efforts to integrate the innovation channels, these new kind of bottom-up, outwardly focused channels to central company strategy, this may fade away again in a few years. 3 years is a long time in big company budgets. It's a short time in the venture capital world. So corporate venture capital that doesn't demonstrate some real interesting results within the next few years is in grave danger. Anyway, it's still a question. And I'm really kind of to the conclusion of my talk. I'm looking forward to questions from you. Who's going to win the U.S.-China competition? Frankly, I don't know. I think that this would require another probably hour-long talk. There are so many different factors involved. But I can say this, in the intense competition between the U.S. and China, the world really needs Japan and the EU. As a specific example, GDPR, the General Data Privacy Regulation that came out in the EU, has had a major influence on Silicon Valley startup companies. I visited a Silicon Valley startup company that had all of 10 people and is in the data management space a few months ago. And I said, well, are you worried about privacy? And the founder looked at me and said, oh, we're GDPR compliant. This is a company that is still months away from international expansion, but had already figured that in. So that's a major role that we need to have Japan and the points of view of Japan and the EU for. And I guess the biggest question that I think we all need to worry about is, does this model of government-subsidized pre-innovation research and then transferring it to the industry for innovation, does that work when you have a very tight government relationship between a national government like China and Chinese companies? On the one hand, can the U.S. compete against it? Because it's hard to tell where the subsidies stop being appropriate and when they become anti-competitive. On another hand, though, the question I would like to leave everyone with is, will what looked like all the weaknesses that Japan Inc. has looked like it's had throughout the Heisei period, will it be even worse if there's a China Inc.? It could be. And so this is why the competition will affect everybody. That's really what I had for prepared remarks. I'd be very happy to answer your questions. Thanks for your attention.
So thank you very much, Richard Dasher, for a genuinely serious talk and with serious implications. And before I open the floor to questions, I'd like to use the chair's prerogative to ask the question which I posited in the notice which I wrote about your speech, which is you alluded to it, you came to us 5 years ago in 2014. I remember very much that you had a very, very pessimistic, or rather realistic view of Japanese innovation, saying that it was full of bottlenecks, troubles, difficulties with pre-existing ways of doing things that people didn't want to abandon. Here you are 5 years later. You have mentioned that there have been an awful lot of positive changes. So can you tell us why have these positive changes taken place in some companies, but clearly not in others?
I tend to look at the demand side of an equation like that. A company that feels threatened will be more willing to change. And I have to say that it's a combination of different factors. There's the attitude among the labor force. There is early recognition by the senior levels of the company that they're in deep trouble. And that so many things have happened that they didn't expect. Who in the Japanese auto industry expected Google to be a competitor? And so I think that did get the top people concerned. The conservative elements are at the mid-level. They're the people who've been doing sales for 25 or 30 years. They probably don't really want to change anyway. And so as long as they can keep doing business and keep their good customer relationships that they have, they're not going to do anything. And so one of the things that these innovation groups in the big companies must do is not only bring in new things to the company that the company hasn't been expecting, but find the pain points of those people inside the business units and continue to show concern for them. Balance the workload so that you're not just doing what they tell you to do, but you have to establish credibility with them, and you have to establish yourself as a valuable thing for them. This is this Nemoashi basis for business in Japan, and it just hasn't filtered through the whole organization yet. But I think I've been watching this glacier start to calve. It just keeps more and more cracks coming up, and eventually it will change.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now I'll open the floor to questions, at first from the working press, but if time allows, then we will move to other people. I have an eye problem these days, so if you do wish to ask questions, put your hand up really high. Okay, this is a question here. And please identify yourself and your affiliation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'm Kenji Kawase from Nikkei. Okay. Yeah, a few questions. I'm interested in Huawei and also the spat between the U.S. and China. So my question will be focused on that. First of all, you mentioned in your speech about talking to all these people in the industry. Huawei is about a year advanced, you said. Would you please elaborate a bit more on that? In what ways? That's my first question on with the state where they stand in this 5G era. Number two is on the whole notion of where innovation comes from. I think the conventional wisdom, or what we sort of knew about innovation, was that innovation comes from an atmosphere, an environment like Silicon Valley, or somewhere around Boston area, or somewhere with you're able to speak freely, act freely, that sort of environment. When you turn to China, I've spent many years in China reporting, and you can't really do whatever you like. I mean, you get in trouble. I mean, some of the private enterprise people disappear all of a sudden, right? And I don't think it's an environment where you sort of think about of innovation. Could you comment on that notion where China is coming from? How come that's happening? Is it really happening? Is it only like a copycat plus something, or is it something really new from your perspective? Thank you very much.
Okay, so those are great questions. Thank you very much. First of all, with regard to the Huawei situation, Huawei has a very narrow layer of a very deep technology stack. At the very basics of the chip layer, the U.S. is still arguably ahead. You've got companies like NVIDIA and Intel that are supplying most of the chips to the data centers, and a lot of the chips on the edge devices too. At the layer of the integrated telecom network, especially things like radio access and handoff of a signal from one base station to another base station, this was where the American telecom companies basically didn't see any reason to invest their R&D money. And so the Chinese companies had a very wide open field. That's where the real competition is. One level above that, at the data routing level, the American companies are still strong. Cisco Systems and companies like VMware are really strong in managing cloud computing. But as we transition to a drastically new era, if we really get into a 5G network, the number of base stations will go up by at least 5x. And, you know, signals will be handed off every 100 or 200 meters. There will be data going through not only from a multitude of devices, but there's going to be all kinds of data spikes whenever something happens. So I think that you have to give Huawei credit for doing really good work. I don't really, so I'm not an expert in that technology. That's why I talked to the experts, including the Stanford professor who is advising a major foreign government, I won't say which, on 5G adoption. And that professor told me at least a year. So, you know, this is something where we were asleep at the switch. But we were asleep at the switch because that's the right business decision to make. And so how do you deal with this government-industry relationship? Now, with regard to where innovation comes from, there are a lot of really creative, innovative young people in China. And it's very socially acceptable to start a company there. The amount of venture capital in China exceeded that in the United States last year. So this is a huge, rapid growth in the amount of money that's available for these kinds of research. And the Chinese government, as long as this is for the national benefit of China and you keep your friends in the right places, they're happy with it, right? They're not trying to preserve existing companies like Baidu and Alibaba and Tencent because those were private sector companies anyway. They're taking care of the state-owned enterprises. But basically, the real new technologies are largely private sector in China. I do think that one of the issues with China is it's still more important who you know in terms of being successful with something. And you can argue that that's a kind of universal trait. But in terms of risk hedging, hedging by who you know is probably a more dominant pattern there than it is in other places. Now, I should backtrack though and say the number of IP litigation cases in China is exploding. And so China has discovered that intellectual property is important for its industrial base. And frankly, foreign companies that bring IT litigation in China have a better track record of success than do domestic Chinese companies. But there's still some issues with lack of concern with consistency in legal precedent, in regard to legal precedent. You don't really know how the court's going to rule in your case, no matter what kind of rulings there were before. So that's probably the best I can say about both of those.
Thank you. Working press? Do I see a hand? Working press, not pressing work, just working press. No, okay, so I'll open the floor to others. Sorry, yes, please go ahead. Thank you.
And there's another hand close to him. Okay,
okay, sure, got it, yeah.
Hello, Albert Siegel, I'm a freelancer. I mean, you've got this, obviously, this great technological boom now, but I see this, it's quite reminiscent of what it was at the last dot-com boom, where people were throwing money. You had like Home Grocer with this whole automation thing about delivery and things like this. And I myself worked in an IT company back then, Internet Tools Corporation, which went belly up due to poor market research. Anyways, do you see this as, I mean, all the big companies making big news as far as the tech startups, I mean, Uber is a great example, of course, are not profitable, and there's just really no profitability in sight, and still people keep pumping money into it. It's like a giant Ponzi scheme. So what's your opinion on this? Do you see this as another even bigger bubble about to burst?
I do worry about that. Now, that's kind of another talk topic, but basically one of the major things in the whole kind of startup growth world is the pre-IPO mega deal, which is more than $100 million at one shot of venture capital. And this is allowing companies to extend their time of unprofitability even further. A lot of them really haven't made a profit yet. And personally, I kind of have an issue with investing in a company that doesn't have a price-earnings ratio because it doesn't have earnings per share. And I do think that there's always the possibility of a technology bust. The dot-com was a classic bubble. Now, I think that venture capital in China may be a bubble. And if it acts like bubbles have in China before, that means that the government will engineer a steady deflation of the bubble rather than an absolute blowout. In the US and here, I think that there is enough change in everyday life that is really justifying a lot of what we're doing. I think there's always going to be failure, there's always going to be overvalued companies, but look how your lives are different now than they were 2 years ago. And it's happening in a very rapid time. The word industrial revolution is absolutely appropriate. And a lot of value is being created there. So on the whole, I'm positive. I think that the system is going to have its ups and downs, but it's not going to go away. And what we've had is a structural change where the big companies in the United States are really looking at startup companies as a way to efficiently access potentially disruptive new ideas. Efficiently because it would waste more of their money if they started from square one. Much better to buy a company that they think is within a few years of profitability. Does that make sense? Thank you. And you had a question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Phil Rowe of the Capital Group. I think the premise of your speech today was to make us optimistic about Japan, but it didn't change my view at all.
That's a question.
The key issue is the pace of change and what efforts that the Japanese government can do to increase the pace of change in Japan. Because Japan is fantastically inventive, fantastically creative. The false dichotomy of not being creative and creative is not true at all. But the pace of change is so slow in Japan. The primary method listed here for startups was partnerships. that is molasses change. And so, the change is fostered by new startup companies. But the Japanese legal system is designed with the bankruptcy laws to squash innovation. So what can the Japanese government do to increase the pace of change?
Thank you.
That's a very good question. It is molasses change. I would have to say, though, that it's dangerous to become emotional about Japan either positively or negatively. And I try to watch that about myself carefully because I'd like to see Japan change. And I do see a lot of frustration. Just this week, I was with the founder of a company who had to declare bankruptcy after 18 years. And he lost his house. He had to sell his house. That's the kind of thing that we try to avoid in the United States. I do think that changes in bankruptcy laws, I do think that there's a lot of things that the government could do that would make startup company creation more attractive as a rational way to run your career. I think that it's interesting, why does it work well in the U.S.? I think it's worked well partly because the government has brought in its own outside experts in rather positive ways. Most of the big government funding programs in the United States have program managers who either who were at university, or some of them even worked in industry. They know how people write grant proposals, and so they can find the tricky stuff very well. On the other hand, I think that the U.S. government has done a pretty good job of keeping out of the way of growth and this sort of thing. But it's, there's no one silver bullet. I think that this is a situation that, to some extent, the biggest danger for Japan is its own kind of humility-based self-deprecation. There are a lot of good people in Japan, and I think that if they had a little bit more good connections and you could develop some sort of better mentoring programs for them, we may see more changes in the future. But yeah, it's molasses. It takes a long time for this, and we're not over the top yet. I agree with you 100% there. Thank you.
Okay, anyone from the Stanford group, by any chance, who's dying to ask a question? Anyone who has not gone to Stanford and wants to ask a question? Okay. Yeah. Right. Okay, there. Please. Thank you. There's the
Hi. My name is Kumiko Miyazaki. I visited you maybe 14 years ago at Stanford.
Okay.
Yes, we've been doing some research on AI as well in my lab. AI has applications in many sectors: healthcare, manufacturing, drug development, even in the education. Like Kanazawa Institute of Technology, they're using AI to give guidance to students what kind of courses they should be taking. Some companies are using AI for when they're hiring people. But AI has been going through several booms. The first boom was in maybe the 1960s, and the second boom was in the 1980s when expert systems were the main focus. So now we are in the third AI boom. And according to publications, we've found out that China overtook US. So in terms of the number of publications in AI, China is #1, followed by US, and then other countries like even Iran and India, they're in the sort of top 5. Japan comes to about maybe 14th position in AI basic research. So I've said that, yes, it's in the third boom. So, for example, in autonomous driving, we are sort of at the level of 2 or maybe reach level 2 or 3. But in order to reach level 5, there has to be changes in laws. There has to be sort of ethical issues have to be overcome. And so I was wondering, so full-scale adoption of AI, what do you think? There are many issues to be overcome. And also AI is a dual-use technology, because robots could be killer robots as well, and so it's a dual-use technology. So all of these because of all these concerns, do you think that?
You've addressed a number of issues that are very interesting issues.
So do you think it won't be a boom, and will it stay? So what should?
What's different between this boom and the previous ones? How cheap computer processing is, and how much data is available for analysis. Without the cloud basis for data being accessible, you could not have sufficient amounts of data to do the kind of analysis that companies are doing now. So that's a new thing. And I don't think that's going to go away. I am very happy that Stanford has just started a major research initiative called Human AI that is being run by the director of Stanford's AI lab with a lot of industry participation just a few weeks ago. And a lot of these human issues are going to be addressed and should be addressed. They're very important to address. I think that with regard to the ethical issues, the safety issues, those are things where, frankly speaking, governments should pay attention to regulation. Now, the typical way of regulating something is to be too specific and not to have enough flexibility. Look at American export controls. For the longest kind of time, I really should not have brought this Mac laptop to China because it had a microprocessor in it that was classified as a supercomputer. And, you know, that kind of thing has been an issue for a long time. But we're at the beginning of 20 to 30 years, I would say, of steady new applications of AI in all sorts of areas. One of the things that will become very obvious is that if people don't want it, it will not be successful. And so if the AI at Kanazawa Institute of Technology doesn't give students a reason for the decisions that they can trust, they will not use it. And that kind of thing is, some of the value of AI is not so much in doing the analysis itself, it's in making the reasons behind the analysis more transparent. That's something that a doctor could use to reduce malpractice claims. And so I think that a lot is yet to be worked out, but now this is definitely not going to go away. There will be new kinds of applications. We will see this wave merge into the next wave, because I do think quantum computing is closer than I thought it was a year ago. But you know, we'll see AI around for a long time. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? And can we have a question, a relatively short question? Thank you. Yes, there's somebody standing up. Good, fine, thank you. Right.
Hi, it's Langan. I'm also freelance. I have two questions, if I can. The first one is when Apple sort of reinvented itself and came out with all of its wonderful products, one of them, the iPod, The Economist did a feature piece on it and showed, I forget the exact percentage, but something like 60–70% of the guts of the machine were made by Japanese companies you've never heard of. So you've seen that in other products as well, where the Japanese genius seems to be, the innovation seems to be in, you know, not leading the gold rush, as it were, but making the new spade that, you know, makes it all happen and making money off that. So aren't we kind of still, we seem to be flogging this dead horse that somewhere, somehow, Japan will invent its own Google or its own whatever, when as I say, it seems to be that the innovation is in that field. So maybe the Walkman was the exception that proves the rule rather than. So your thoughts on that? And secondly, the whole sort of fears about AI, particularly what's come out in this Homo Deus book. And he's pointing out that we're focused on the machines and the machines taking over. But he's talking about, actually, everybody in this room right now is just a biochemical reaction, you know. And with brain scanning technology going on the way it is, we are beginning to reach the point where if you marry that with AI, you do have some pretty frightening scenarios of humans really being hacked. So do you have any thoughts on that? And
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Those are two great questions as well. I got really distracted by your second question, which is hitting all sorts of buttons in my head. I think that
Do you want to answer the first one? Or the second one
what
first?
was the first one again?
The first one was that
I got really distracted.
The part that you open up an
an Apple. Right, got it.
60–70% of parts are from companies in Japan you never heard of.
So I think that probably most innovation is going to be like that. It's going to be relatively small scale, okay? But it will be new technologies and it will be good. Historically, that's been the only opportunities for startup companies in Japan because the big companies have not partnered with them very well. And so if they didn't have something unique and exceptional that they could put into somebody else's big system, they couldn't stay alive. Because they could not attract enough capital really to grow and do the system all by themselves. How do you have a Silicon Valley, and what is the real essence of Silicon Valley? I have to say that it's not the 15 to 17,000 companies that are created every year. It's the 1 or 2 companies that become world famous companies every 5 or 6 years. The Ubers, the Lyfts, Tesla Motors or whatever's next. And so without that kind of a possibility of a home run, it's really hard for people in the system to be excited enough, or maybe I should say young people to be stupid enough to get into this because it's very high risk. It's the hardest job that there is in the world. And I think that they really have to have sufficient motivation in order to do it. Now, the whole thing about hacking people, the relationship between people and AI is still a long way away from changing. One of the things that is a very interesting survey that came out recently is that the higher your salary level, the more positive view you have of AI. Because you see the likelihood that the artificial intelligence, whatever, is going to help you. Whereas the lower your salary scale, the more you see AI as a threat because you think your job is going to be replaced. And that is a legitimate worry. And that kind of polarization of society is one of the outcomes of innovation. The first time I had, and it was a French person, told me innovation always creates both winners and losers, it really sort of disturbed me, but it's true. And so if in terms of natural economic law you have that kind of thing going on, then you need a government to look at the good of society as a whole. And this is something we haven't figured out the solution to yet. But progress in technology is not going to stop. I think it's a long time before you really have to worry about cyborg-type humans coming online. And there are some functions that AI doesn't do. You know, there are artificial intelligence programs that will write symphonies that people could not distinguish from Mozart symphonies. And yet, That's based on input data. To come up with a symphony like something you've never heard before is still a uniquely human kind of innovation capability. So in the creativity space, people will still take the lead. And I think it's most natural for people to use this technology for their purposes, not the other way around. I don't see that changing anytime soon. Thank you very much, and thanks everybody for all your questions. Great.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Richard, for putting up with my bad jokes. And please watch out for more professional luncheons. Thank you again.
Let me say something.
Well, if you insist, go ahead.
Oh, yeah.
Mitsuya Goto. I'm a life member of this club and an ex-Nissan executive. On May 30th last year, I wrote a letter to Donald Trump saying, don't impose 25% duties on Japanese cars and steel. GM, Ford, and Chrysler, now part of Fiat Chrysler, all retreated from the Japanese market long ago. The only American-made car sold in Japan is Jeep. Incidentally, Donald Trump came to address the luncheon meeting of this club on August 18th, 1993. And he had much darker hair, and he brought 4 months pregnant wife, Mara Maples, out of which Ivanka was born. Now, I sent him, because he said in the Twitter, he was concerned about his thinning hair, so I sent him a bottle of Rehab X5, the best hair-growing liquid sold in Japan. But anyway, what do you have to say about these industrial sectors?
Well, I think that I don't want to get into politics today, but certainly I believe that world trade has benefited everybody a lot. The problem is that because it benefits everybody, people don't notice it. They don't notice how it benefits them. And if you lose jobs because of a new technology or because of globalization of some other company, you see that hurt. And that's one of the problems that we have, is a general lack of understanding of how the world economy works. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And before we split, I'm going to give Richard Dasher his 1-year honorary membership in the hope that he comes back again to us very soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for putting up my project. Oh, that was fun. Thank you.